All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those folks that are in the room, thank you so much for being here in this crazy weather. I appreciate you being in the room. For those folks that are joining us online, I hope you're someplace warm and safe and out of the rain. So thank you so much for joining us in that format as well. My name is Cinnamon Moffat. I'm the person who supports the seminars, and I'll be your host for today. If this is new for you, just letting you know, we do have a hybrid event, so we have folks online and folks in the room. For folks that are online, if you have any questions for today's speaker, or if you have any troubles hearing or seeing the content, please put that question into the chat box of Zoom, and our volunteer, Roseanne, will read that out, and we'll make sure that we can get those addressed and that your questions are heard. For folks that are in the room, when we get to the question and answer, if you just raise your hand, I'll bring you a mic, and that way folks online can hear us as well. So thank you all again for being here. Much appreciated. I wanted to make a couple of announcements. Actually, I've got more than a couple of announcements. So let's see. This month in November is basically whale month. Every single seminar, every single Science on Tap, every single event is going to be about whales. So I just wanted to do a little promo of those. So our next seminar is on November 13th. We have Selena Fergosi, who is an associate professor at Marine Mammal Institute, who's going to be talking about passive acoustics in applied marine mammal research. This one event is not quite whales, but I'm going to say it's whale adjacent. And we have a lunch and learn around the new recycle rules that is happening at noon on November 17th. See, it's whale adjacent. We then have a Science on Tap on December 19th. Trevor Branch is going to be talking about fear and the impact of killer whales on baleen whales. He then is going to do a lunch and learn the following day at noon in the library on similar topic, but focusing in on blue whales. And then that afternoon, we have Clara Bird, who's a postdoc with the Marine Mammal Institute, who's going to be talking about coastal feeding of gray whales foraging off the Oregon coast. So join us at one or all of these great events that are coming our way. The other thing I wanted to promote is that these little blue bins that you're going to start seeing around Hatfield are collection bins for our food drive that we're starting right now. The food that's going in there is directly supporting the food bank that is in our library. So that's for our local community. So if you are interested, you can drop off food in there. If donating money is a little bit more your thing, watch for some of the announcements that are coming out of the library. Financial donation will go to the community food banks. So want to be able to support our community in this time of uncertainty and challenges. So keep an eye out for those blue bins. I'll have one here every seminar. So if you want to think about bringing it when you come to seminar, that would be awesome. Okay. Now that all of that is done, really what we're here for today is for today's speaker. Ana Guasco is an associate professor of marine studies at OSU, is an interdisciplinary researcher working across human geography and marine humanities and political ecology and environmental history. Many of those words for me don't go together, so I'm so excited to learn a little bit more about how this all goes together. She earned her PhD at the University of Cambridge as a Gates Cambridge Scholar, and her current book project is under contract with the University of Chicago Press in Oceans in Depth series, and examines the narrative, history, and justice issues circulating around the migration and conservation of gray whales along our coast. And so I am so excited to hand the mic off to Ana. Make sure you turn your mic on and I'll walk.
Right. Thank you so much. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. And I just want to do a double check, especially for those who are in the back of the room. Can you hear me and understand me well? Thumbs ups? Awesome. Okay, so thank you very much for having me here, especially as my interdisciplinary slew of strange subfields suggests. I am not a marine mammal biologist or ecologist. I am solidly in the humanities and qualitative social sciences. And I'm very happy to bring what I do to the work that you do here at Hatfield, because I see us really being in conversation together, and I'm happy to be in conversation with you today. Okay, so this is the part where I normally explain what gray whales are. It's really exciting to be at the Hatfield Marine Science Center because I'm guessing most people in the room do know what a gray whale is, but just in case anyone wants that little refresher, they are a baleen whale species that migrates between Baja California Sur, Mexico, and the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas of the subarctic and Arctic near Alaska. My project, which was originally my dissertation project in my PhD and is now my book project, looks at gray whales throughout their entire range within the eastern North Pacific population. So not looking so much at the western population or stock, looking at that migration pattern from south to north. So my book structure starts in the south and works its way up to the Alaskan Arctic and beyond. And what I'm doing in my work is following the stories that are particularly salient around human connections with gray whales across time in each of those places. So it's a very kind of back and forth chronology, which means that I'm not always having historians be particularly happy with me. But I'm a geographer by training, and I'm thinking about how gray whales move through this space and connect these stories and people throughout their entire migration. Their nearshore migration, particularly on the northbound route, has facilitated a wide range of human interactions over time. So they're really close to human communities. That's meant that people have seen them and interacted with them in a variety of ways from time immemorial. And I want to tell you a little bit about what brings me to this topic before diving into the specific content for today. So I am from where gray whales migrate. I'm not from Oregon, I'm from Southern California. And I started working at my very first job out of high school as a park ranger at Channel Islands National Park. And that's where I started hearing stories about gray whales that I hadn't heard before. I'd be out on boats hearing people doing narration on whale watching boats about how the whales that we're seeing right here in front of us are known as the friendly whale. And if you just go down south over the border, you can touch and pet them. Up here, we have to stay many yards away due to the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but you can interact with them differently across that border. And what made that all the more remarkable, according to these stories, was that gray whales had previously been known as the devilfish, the most difficult to whale for Yankee whalers, these sort of ferocious beasts who had this remarkable transformation from devilfish to friendly whale. So as an undergraduate, I heard these stories while I was switching from being an environmental science major to being an American studies major. And I wanted to know, how did these stories come to be? How did this different kind of interaction come to be? My original project was very, very narrow. It was about travel writing and memoirs of people who went to Baja to touch the whales and what they said about that and how it affected them. In my dissertation, I expanded that to not just the devilfish to friendly whale story in the lagoons, but to the entire range of gray whales. So if you're interested in the other work that I do outside of this specific story, I'm happy to talk to that as well in the Q&A. But specifically what I'm going to be focusing on today is that devilfish to friendly whale story arc. So this is one of the most famous stories of gray whales. And it's also paired with another famous story about gray whales, which is their arc from endangered to conservation success story. And the reason that I'm saying that they're paired is that the short version of the devilfish to friendly whale story is that in the heyday of Yankee whaling, which refers to whaling ships that are coming out of US ports, it's not New York specific, it gets a little confusing. Yankee whaling in the 19th century experienced these ferocious whales that were almost too difficult to whale until the invention of the exploding harpoon gun allowed them to get sort of a competitive advantage over these difficult to whale whales that were known for defending their calves and ramming boats and so on. And that as conservation in the early 20th century started to take place, as threats to gray whales through whaling started to decline with the decline of the gray whale whaling industry, gray whales started to experience this kind of respite from human threats where they could start to build up trust with humans that allowed them to transform into the friendly whale by the 1970s. Timing is really important in this story. The timing is supposed to be that devilfish persisted until around maybe the end of whaling or maybe a little bit after that, and that the friendly whale didn't emerge until that moment of respite and that trust could be built up, and that it first emerged in the 1970s. So my original goal with my historical work was just to try to establish a timeline for when exactly these transitions happened. Because within this narrative, it's a little bit hazy when those sorts of pinpoints are. And I anticipated there might be two different timelines. One for when we can see actual changes in whale behavior, and one for when people interpreted that as a changed behavior, when people recognized that. So if we think of this as, for example, a classic friendly whale behavior is a whale approaching a boat very closely. Now, some people might interpret that as friendly. Some people might interpret that as, oh my God, it's about to ram my boat. That's a devilfish. So that's the sort of distinction, is that the behavior might change, but you also have to have the human recognition of behavior changing. What I ended up finding was I couldn't establish that timeline because the transition didn't happen. There was no smooth, clean transition from devilfish to friendly whale. Instead, the devilfish continued long after it was supposed to have been fated or tamed, and the friendly whale appeared far earlier than it was supposed to have been able to emerge. So what I'm going to take you through is the historical evidence I've used to make this big assertion. All right, so the start of Yankee whaling. We have to talk about this gentleman here, Charles Melville Scammon. As far as I am aware, no relation to Herman Melville of Moby Dick, besides similar topics of interest. So Yankee whaling is the start of broad-scale commercial whaling of gray whales in the mid-19th century. There was indigenous whaling of gray whales throughout the west coast of North America. From what we know, it doesn't seem that there was very much in the lagoons of Mexico. And there hadn't been much interest from Spanish colonizers in the Baja Peninsula. There had been notes from Jesuit missionaries about the presence of whales that may have alerted Yankee whalers to the whales, but they hadn't themselves been that interested in that particular industry. So it gets started around 1845, really kicks off in the 1850s when Scammon supposedly discovers a lagoon, although I will say he didn't discover anything, given that local people knew about it. But it was then named Scammon's Lagoon for a time. And he was really kind of the figure responsible for the biggest increases in numbers of whales killed in these lagoons. And so he's a very controversial and interesting figure because he's at once responsible for massive destruction of gray whales, and he's also one of the earliest figures in amassing information and scientific knowledge about gray whales. He wrote a behemoth numbers are hard for me at this moment for some reason, 1874 book on marine mammals, and its very first chapter was devoted to California gray whales. His writings were among the earliest to use the devilfish moniker, and sometimes he's later been credited with that, although he didn't actually coin it. It was already circulating a bit, and he's referring to how whalers understood the gray whale as this particularly devilish, especially when mothers were defending their calves. But interestingly, although it's not usually what's said about Scammon and his writings in this book, Scammon already was showing a more nuanced understanding of gray whales in that 1874 book. So in addition to the sort of devilish, ferocious, aggressive, etc., he also described gray whales as playful, as engaging in extensive maternal care, and as sagacious. The word sagacity or sagacious comes up again and again about their wisdom. Sometimes it's about being wise, sometimes it's about being wily, which kind of then ties back into devilish. But he was really interested in how smart they were, in how much they could understand what whalers were doing, and he had some appreciation for the complexity of these whales. But this appreciation didn't in any way lead him to have sympathy for the whales or be concerned for their conservation, despite the fact that he anticipated they would go extinct. The only time I found where he demonstrated sympathy for gray whales was in his discussions of indigenous whaling. So his discussions of Yankee whaling would be very clinical, very sort of just matter of fact, we did this, we did this. And then when he turned to discussing indigenous whaling, he would describe indigenous hunters as savage, as sort of lying in wait to ambush these poor creatures who are unaware that these people are going to attack them. And so what I find interesting here is that the only way that he's able to muster sympathy for gray whales is through his anti-indigenous racism. It's not just the racism of a man of his time that we can dismiss, it's actually part and parcel with his understanding of human relationships with whales. And a second piece I want to mention here that's sort of a thread throughout the research that I'm presenting is that Scammon and most other work writing about the devilfish is nostalgic. His 1874 book was not a contemporaneous whaler's logbook of what he was seeing at the time. It was a career retrospective. It was written as the industry was already declining, as the species was already declining. And many other species that are, articles or other sources that use the devilfish or talk about how whalers use the devilfish were similarly looking back on the past. They were nostalgic rather than contemporaneous accounts. And the image I've used to illustrate this is the start of Scammon's book, the 1874 book. It's this idyllic illustration that until you look closer looks like it's just sort of a romantic, pretty coastal scene. And when you look more closely, it's a lagoon, a calving lagoon in Baja California Sur, where whalers in small boats off of large tall ships are coming to harpoon whales. It's titled Whaling Scene in the California Lagoon. This image mirrors an often quoted line near the end of the entire volume. Quote, "Here the scene of slaughter was exceedingly picturesque," end quote. This description and cover image and other depictions of this sort of devilfish Yankee whaling imaginary were nostalgic visions, keying into late 19th century yearning for a not yet gone, but increasingly romanticized era of commercial whaling. It was both backwards looking and anticipatory, anticipating a future in which whales and whaling were no more. But that future had not arrived by 1874, and it was not guaranteed, nor did everyone anticipate it. All right, so the next stage, because I will mention, although Scammon had a more nuanced interpretation of whales, of gray whales, he didn't actually see them as friendly. I will acknowledge that wasn't there yet. However, by the late 19th century, past the era of Scammon, that image was starting to emerge. So what I've found in reviewing a large amount of primarily historical newspaper articles, often unattributed to individual writers, is that these sorts of stories, perhaps tall tales or fish stories about whales, in which people have all these sorts of exciting encounters with whales, really proliferated in the late 19th century, especially amidst broader public interest in expanding access to ocean space and marine exploration. And a really, really common way for gray whales to be talked about in these stories was as a combination of playful and monstrous, so the sort of devilish and the friendly coexisting alongside each other. So for example, one nationally syndicated historic newspaper article from 1883 described a playful and frolicsome old California gray that had reportedly taken quite a fancy to a small fishing boat. The whale hit the boat, then resurfaced before diving and disappearing, and two men on board hoped that the monster had left. When the whale reappeared, and this is what's about to be depicted on the left here, they shot at it, which didn't seem to have much effect on the whale, as the whale continued to accompany them for quite a while before moving on. Despite describing this behavior as playful, the article concluded by saying that the men had, quote, never felt more anxiously uncomfortable in their lives than while running in the company with this playful sea monster. So in this kind of telling a strange combination of devilfish and friendlier, more playful monster are coming together. But the very first I've been able to find, I'm not saying it's absolutely the first, but from my research, the first I've been able to find of explicitly friendly behavior that was also recognized by the viewers or interpreters at the time as friendly was 1895, which I'll remind you is a lot earlier than the 1970s. In 1895, a column on the right here titled "Sociable Pacific Whales" reportedly described gray whales as harmless monsters that, quote, like to make friends with vessels, end quote. It recounted the story of a gray whale reportedly following a South American-bound ship for 3 weeks. This curious companion reportedly, quote, played about it, attempting no injury, but swimming alongside and receiving many bullets in its blubber without resenting them. end quote. The column then recounted another story of a whale that was seen off of Catalina Island in Southern California, which pulled a line and nearly capsized a fisherman. This behavior was not seen as violent or malicious, but as a playful whale accidentally getting caught in the line. Other whales then joined this one and, quote, played about the bow, end quote. The article concluded that these whales, quote, doubtless thought that the yacht was a new kind of whale and were literally trying to scrape acquaintance, end quote. The vessel-following whale, the one that didn't resent all the bullets being sent into its blubber, kept appearing in a lot of different articles over time, over the next decade or so, including one titled Love Affair of Whales. This focused on a tour boat captain, again off of Catalina Island, who said that gray whales, quote, get so foolish they even fall in love with boats. He recounted a gray whale that got so close it scared everyone on board and said, I never saw so affectionate an old cuss as this. He called the whale sociable for rubbing against the boat, but at the same time, he said he didn't want to shoot it because these whales are known for being particularly aggressive, the most fearsome of all. He started talking about how the reason that this behavior might occur is that the whales think boats are other whales and are trying to court them, hence the Love Affairs of Whale title. And that skippers don't try to have these types of close encounters despite encountering them regularly because of the gray whale's fearsome reputation. This ship-following story kept showing up again and again and is depicted in the left here as well. And my favorite interpretation in one is that someone describing the story said that of the sort of crew on board shooting bullets at the whale, it didn't mind them and interpreted them as, quote, love taps. So I will say again, this might be a fish story. This might not have happened. But what it does show is a really early interpretation of whales as friendly, regardless of whether or not a single bit of this is true. It shows people in the 1890s understanding gray whales as friendly, as falling in love with boats, as not resenting being shot at. And the fact that they're being shot at also shows that the devilfish behavior wasn't immediately being exhibited in the face of violence every single time. Friendly whale behavior was being exhibited. So violence or negative interactions or harassment, whatever language we might want to use today, was coexisting alongside the production of friendly whale behavior. By the turn of the 20th century, you start seeing a wider range of different kinds of depictions of gray whales emerging. Now, for a bit of historical context here, by the turn of the 20th century, the whaling industry for gray whales was on severe decline. So Yankee whalers had largely abandoned the lagoons of Baja California Sur by the 1890s or so, turn of the 20th century. The Norwegians would leave by the 1920s at the latest. The coastal whaling industry for gray whales was also largely becoming obsolete because the numbers of whales had gotten so low from 2 successive rounds of intensive whaling in the mid-19th century. So amidst this kind of decline and increasing recognition that gray whales were either on decline or in danger of becoming extinct, you see some different kinds of images coming out. You still see the devilfish description, but you start also seeing gray whales being understood as victims. So the first example I have of that is of ship strikes. So today when we think of a ship strike, we might always just think, bad. Ship strikes for whales are bad. But in the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, a very common depiction of ship strikes was that the whale had attacked the boat. So an enraged whale attacking a ship, often to get revenge for a mate having been killed by a ship or that kind of thing. It's this sort of obviously very anthropomorphic motivation being ascribed to whales to be seen as the sort of perpetrator of an attack. But at the same time, you start seeing other interpretations emerge. So I have on the right an image from a Scientific American article in 1901 in which the author suggests that gray whales are actually victims of their own sociable disposition. So the fact that they're interested in approaching boats is making them victims of boats themselves. It makes them more likely to be hit by boats. It described ship strikes as violent, but not as whales ramming into the boat. So the sort of action of violence is reversed here. Instead of whale against boat, it's boat against whale, in what matches more with what we would sort of think of today in what happens in a ship strike. Another new source of victimization, and this connects with the upcoming Science on Tap that you have on fear and killer whales, was that a new devil alternative emerged, the killer whale or orca. So rising public interest in killer whales in the early 20th century led to a shift in seeing gray whales as actually kind of pathetic victims in stories about killer whales attacking them. So instead of the gray whale as the aggressive, scary devilfish of the sea, suddenly it's the cowering, sad, pathetic victim of killer whales that were described as submarine butchers, bloodthirsty monsters which hunt in packs like wolves, brutally attacking gray whale mother-calf pairs. So as interest in and vilification of the killer whale emerges, the gray whale becomes kind of a foil to the killer whale. All this takes place on the background of gray whale endangerment and potential extinction. In the turn of the 20th century and into the early 20th century, gray whales were very much on the decline. And some people believed they were extinct in California and throughout the West Coast. So what I've found really interesting in looking at this era is at the same time that people are reporting that gray whales have gone extinct, there are also continued reports of catches, encounters, ship strikes, whether devilish or friendly or pathetic or aggressive. All of these types of encounters are continuing throughout this era. But at the same time, you're also seeing reports that gray whales are completely gone from this era, from this area. And in 1911, American Museum of Natural History researcher Roy Chapman Andrews, who, fun fact, is a potential inspiration for the fictional character of Indiana Jones. That's this gentleman on the right here, in his hip boots and his cap, looking very dapper on a whaling ship, probably not getting very dirty on that ship. He embarked on an expedition to the Korean Peninsula to try to determine whether any gray whales still existed in the Pacific. Andrews and reporters covering the expedition regularly claimed that gray whales had been extinct for years in the North American Pacific, despite these continued reports of catches and encounters. Headlines declared, "Gray whale still lives," and Andrews rediscovered the gray whale by finding a population in Korea. Although, a similar note on discovery, he did not discover gray whales in Korea, given that local people told him where they were. At the same time as Andrews was searching for gray whales across the Pacific, Southern California's eccentric figure of Captain John D. Loop regularly made the local news for his entrepreneurial ambitions around gray whales. He took President Theodore Roosevelt on a whale hunting trip from Long Beach to Baja California in 1911, the same year as Andrews was going to Korea. And in 1912, upon reading a Scientific American piece that Andrews wrote about his expedition, he reportedly, quote, laughed in his sleeve, end quote, because Andrews had apparently been invited to Long Beach to go look for gray whales there. And he said that he thought no creature could be found in that part of the world. Loop speculated that Andrews traveled to Korea to, quote, make his work seem more important, end quote. Loop's gray whale exploits continued through at least 1920 in California. Among various other activities, he reportedly sold tickets to see harpooned whales as exhibits, not just gray whales, other species too. He introduced Californians to whale meat, according to himself, proposed selling whale milk as an alternative to cow milk, planned to sell whales for fertilizer and automobile tires, specifically gray whales, saying that they were plentiful enough that they might as well be turned into something useful. And he even invented an aerial harpoon to hunt whales from blimps, although I don't think that one ended up working out. Yet even Loop acknowledged the likely impending extinction of gray whales, but again, like Scammon, without calling for conservation. So amidst these sorts of different accounts, with accounts of gray whales and what they're doing, both devilfish and friendly whale versions are persisting, even as gray whales are on the decline, but also other versions are kind of coming into this mix, this pairing of victim or villain, these sort of ship strike angle, the killer whale angle, the extinction angle, much more complex images of what the gray whale is and how it interacts with people are emerging throughout this time. The final era that I want to talk to you about is the mid-20th century. By the mid-20th century, so we're talking 1950s or so here, we start having a different set of interactions come about. And I'll remind you, by the 1950s, we shouldn't be seeing devilfish behavior anymore. So as a quick overview on gray whale conservation timing, conservation measures started at earliest in the 1920s. The earliest documented conservation measure for gray whales came from the Macaw tribe in what is currently Washington state when they voluntarily decided to stop whaling for conservation purposes. National and international regulations started to come about in the late 1930s, not necessarily effectively until the late 1940s. So throughout the sort of 1920s until about 1950, you have an increasing era of conservation, not for all whale species, but for gray whales. And on top of that, the whaling industry for gray whales had virtually been extinguished. It wasn't profitable anymore. So they had essentially been subject to both de facto and de jure protections. So we shouldn't be seeing the devilfish anymore by 1950. They weren't being bothered, right? Well, the third era that I want to talk to you about is expeditions to Baja, largely undertaken by people from the US wanting to encounter gray whales. The first set is kind of more on the tourism and photography side. It was very increasingly popular to go to Baja as kind of an adventure. It was a very often exotified location in very problematic ways. We can think of work like John Steinbeck's traveling to this area. Language around the idea of it being an untouched Eden was very common in sort of in travel logs depicting going to this kind of remote and harsh environment, as it was often understood. The one that I'm interested in telling you a little bit about is novelist Earl Stanley Gardner, who wrote a very popular detective series that was recently made as a detective series on HBO. So continuing to have cultural relevance, although not necessarily for the whale work. He had a 1960 travel memoir called Hunting the Desert Whale, which is one of the nicknames that gray whales are known by. And he regularly refers to trying to photograph whales as hunting them. So at no point in this book is he actually hunting with a gun or harpoon, but he is sort of doing this metaphorical work around photographs and shooting that becomes very common in the ways that people talk about photography and wildlife tourism in the 20th century. He says that when he went to Baja, he'd never heard about the devilfish behavior. He was not familiar with it. He wasn't expecting it. And the local fishermen, local sea turtle fishermen at Laguna Ojo de Liebre, which is the one that had been known as Scammon's Lagoon at the time, scoffed at the idea that gray whales were aggressive or that you needed to be worried around them or careful around them at all. But what he reported was that they suddenly shifted from being neighborly to being aggressive because of people trying to photograph them. So people pursuing them for the purposes of trying to get a good photograph suddenly turned these otherwise peaceable whales into devilfish. He said that word would get around among the whales that they were there and they'd suddenly change their behavior in response to their small boats. And other people in this time also reported similar experiences. The actor Errol Flynn and a camera crew for a 1952 short documentary reportedly had similar experiences. Flynn tried to film gray whales from helicopter, probably around San Diego, and they became very agitated and aggressive, probably because they didn't like a helicopter being right on top of them. And like Gardner, Flynn compared whaling and photography, stating in the film, quote, "Guess there's a little bit of Moby Dick in all of us, but my camera would have to take the place of a harpoon." my favorite one that I'd like to tell you about. This was the weird rabbit hole of my research I never expected to go down. Whale cardiology in the 1950s. Mid-20th century expeditions to Baja sought to render gray whales not just into photographic subjects, but into medical research subjects. Instead of focusing, as we might sort of expect later in the 20th century, on behavior or ecology or conservation, gray whales were subject to a huge amount of medical research interest in the 1950s. A fairly famous cardiologist, Dr. Paul Dudley White, who during this time period became President Eisenhower's personal physician, led expeditions to California and Baja California Sur, attempting to record whales' heartbeats, as did some other expeditions in similar areas. Doing so involves shooting a harpoon with electrodes straight at the heart of a whale in an attempt to record electrical activity. It didn't work too well. Like their photographic and tourism counterparts, they found that gray whales weren't too into their harassment. White's expedition quickly found that gray whales don't respond placidly to being harpooned. The first expedition likely took place near the Scripps Institute off of La Jolla, California. And the headline up on the top left is from that one: weather bad and whales uncooperative, so heart specialists return home. The AP report commented that few whales seen on this expedition, quote, seemed more concerned, most of the whales seen, seemed more concerned with reaching their mating grounds in southern waters than aiding the advancement of science. The whale cardiology researchers decided to try the lagoons, hoping that the whales would be easier to study at the end point of their migration. Any guesses on how that went? They were not more cooperative in the lagoons. Like Scammon's crew before them, White and his coronary explorers, as one newspaper called them, found that the gray whales were just as ferocious, if not more, in 1956 when they finally got to the lagoons. The second expedition, dubbed Expedition Heartbeat, received rapt media attention, particularly now that Paul Dudley White was in the White House. White would radio updates to the media throughout the expedition's misadventures. At one point, expedition members pursued a mother and calf in a small boat, and the mother attacked their vessel. One headline declared that the whales just won't cooperate, and another said whales are wary of bearing their hearts to Dr. White's coronary explorers. Dr. White's expedition and the other ones that are similar to it, including this harpoon of happiness one that was around trying to tranquilize them to accomplish this goal off of Catalina Island in California, did not ultimately achieve any of their stated goals of unlocking the secrets of human hearts. That probably doesn't surprise anyone in this room. There are a few reasons why these studies were fairly poorly designed and had a lot of strange assumptions baked into them. But what I find really interesting in them is what they say about the people who designed them. Why did people want to do this? Why did people want to relive the glory days of whaling? Why did they choose whales instead of a more logical model subject? And why were people so fascinated with watching this unravel? It's a moment that's been pretty much lost to history. And if you're interested in reading about it in more detail, I do have a public scholarship piece in Nursing Cleo on this, where I talk about sort of the why of why people were interested in doing this. But the point that I want to make for this talk is that both in these sort of tourism and photography expeditions and in these whale cardiology expeditions, we can continue to see gray whales exhibiting their classic devilfish behavior. And we continue to see them having reasons to exhibit that behavior. Just because the whaling industry had declined didn't mean that they weren't having those types of encounters with people. We would today probably consider these forms of harassment. That's probably not controversial. And it means that they were continuing to experience humans in this way. Which gets us to the question that I would like to raise, which is, why do any of these stories matter? So I think they're fun, for one thing. You know, These headlines are a lot of fun to read through and to make fun of. But I also think that examining these stories, thinking about how we tell stories about gray whales and any other species for that matter, really does matter. I'm going to tell you about why I think that is. So in sum, to sort of summarize my key sort of contribution and finding here, instead of this devilfish to friendly whale narrative arc that's very sort of clean and simple and appealing in a lot of ways, what I've found is that that transition didn't happen in a sort of binary, linear way, and that far more complex and even contradictory relationships between people and gray whales existed from the mid-19th through mid-20th centuries. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of what I've looked at today might be fish stories, which is, for those of you who might not be familiar with that term, the phrase that comes out of the fishing, often the recreational fishing area of sort of, I once caught a fish this big, and they're probably making it up. That's a fish story. And that word comes up a lot in talking about whale tales. People over-exaggerate, people come up with all sorts of fanciful things. And my goal is not just to say, okay, this story is a fish story, or it's not completely accurate, or to poke holes in a story that people find appealing. What I'm interested in is sort of twofold here. First, that even if not every one of these stories is true, they tell us something interesting. They tell us about how ideas were circulating out in public, even if the information behind them wasn't true. They tell us what people were interested in, what they found appealing, and we can think about how those ideas circulating affected people's understanding of whales, of human interactions with nature, and how that might affect conservation decision-making, wildlife management decision-making. Essentially, regardless of their veracity, they were out there doing work in ways that are important to attend to. And that's true too with the devilfish to friendly whale story. I'm not just interested in sort of disproving it for disproving its sake. I think that the way that we tell this story really, really matters. And one of the reasons that I think that's the case is the explanation that people often ascribe to why that devilfish to friendly whale transition happened. This is something I found way back in my undergraduate senior thesis that I'm still working through, I'm still grappling with, which is that the explanation that most often comes up when people say, why did the devilfish become the friendly whale, is forgiveness. Forgiveness for guilty ecological histories that we have inherited. Now, that's usually a very homogenized, generalized we. That's something I would point out is important to think about when we tell stories about nature. It tends to be a homogenized humanity, not recognizing differences in social history, cultural history, that mean people have had different relationships with different species in different places over time. But it's also worth wondering, why do people want gray whales to have forgiven them? What are people coming into that desire with? Why do people want that? What histories inform that? How does that desire shape the way they approach policy, shape the way they approach conservation, tourism, all sorts of other topics? What I'm interested in doing with this story is saying that maybe instead of asking gray whales to forgive us, a limited us or a broad us, regardless of whether or not gray whales can forgive us, that's a whole different can of worms. I think that we can do more useful work, more helpful work, more socially just work, and more ecologically resilient work by embracing messy, contradictory human relationships and not trying to sort of be atoned of our sins and cast off those histories, not to be touched again. So in sum, I think that narratives and stories matter. They affect conservation framing. They affect how people remember events and connect to them. They affect every aspect of human dimensions that are shaping the kinds of conservation and ecology work that happen in everyone's work here at Hatfield. They affect our understanding of what basic baselines are. So that's something I haven't touched on too much, but doing historical work like this helps us understand what behavioral baselines might be like in a species that we might be trying to restore or help recover in some way. And historians can help biologists and other natural scientists understand that kind of material and contextualize it. Because sometimes what you might encounter if you try to find historical data on that is a whole bunch of fish stories that all contradict each other. And that's what someone like me can help sort through, is what's going on there. So that's my little call for transdisciplinary research. The gray whale conservation success story is one that is often sort of used to look at other species. How we narrate gray whales' histories doesn't just affect gray whales and gray whale-human relationships, it affects all sorts of other species too that look to that model. So how we narrate it, making that more complicated and more complex, I believe has the power to also help how we look to those relationships, those histories, and those conservation frameworks for other species as well. All right, I will take a break there for questions, and thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so very, very much. We're going to take turns between folks online and folks in the room, and I can see already we've got a question online. Go ahead, Roseanne.
Can you talk about how you find and sort through historical evidence when you're doing research?
Absolutely. I would like to tell you I have a really good high-tech system. I've actually, since doing this work, done a digital humanities fellowship that was aimed at being more efficient with finding this kind of material, and I didn't like the way that it worked at all. I'm not an efficient researcher. I am a go on Chronicling America, the Library of Congress's free digitized historical newspapers, if anyone's interested. It does still currently work amidst the shutdown. And I searched the phrase gray whale in both spellings and cull through every single page of results, looking at every single result, calling out which ones are actually relevant and which ones are things like the whaling ship Lady Grey, which is the one that had quite a number of problems from what I can tell. It showed up in the news a lot, not relevant to what I do. So I have very meticulous, essentially, I do a lot of digital historical research, and that requires a lot of time, attention, patience, and recording of everything that you've done. So it's a very meticulous process. There's also ways that you can do more in-person archival work, and my archival work in that context looks really different depending on sort of what specific archive I'm at. And what they might offer me. So for example, at Scott Polar Research Institute, which is at the University of Cambridge, where I was based for most of this work, they didn't explicitly have any materials on gray whales. All of their materials are organized by expeditions or individual people. So it would sort of depend on who I was looking at or what expedition I was looking at. I hope that helps.
Great. Question in the room.
Thanks, Anna. That was really fascinating and great perspective. Yeah, I learned a lot. I had no idea about that whole coronary heart expedition, so that was interesting. Yeah, and really interesting. What I have to say is just a few comments, and then a question. Yeah, I agree. Like the parallels between the different storytelling around gray whales with today's media around politics and everything, how you just can get very different viewpoints depending on whose perspective you're listening to and who's telling the story and what story they want you to tell. So yeah, whether or not it's true or not, it tells you something about how society or sects of society are seeing an issue or a resource or something. So yeah, I agree with that. In terms of storytelling, I'll tell you a story that might be relevant. So yeah, I think we fly drones over the gray whales out here a fair bit. And one behavior that we've noticed more and I'm not saying it's becoming more common, but we're sort of seeing it regularly when we review the footage is what we call a tail swish. So it's literally the whale, swimming, and it does this kind of, it's not necessarily violent, but it's quite rapid and a big swish of its tail back and forth. And my postdoc, who's not here today, hopefully she's online, but we are trying to figure out what context, under what context they do this, because we have seen them do it when they're actually swimming right next to another whale. So like towards a whale, like either like, hey, get away from me, or, let's get in, I'm not interested in you being near me. So this thing about like what the actual behaviors that constitute like being a devilfish, I'm sure their very powerful flukes were a part of that. And just the fact that we see some of these sort of behaviors persist today on a feeding ground, and not even relative to humans, like in boats or in the water, but towards each other. I think you said something about these whales, or I can't remember, but what your wording was, but we commonly talk about context, like how context is really important to the different behaviors that these whales exhibit. So whether they're friendly or, angry, I think, yeah, as it can be towards each other and not necessarily always relevant to what humans are doing around them and our perspective of their behavior. So anyway, that's my story. But then so you had one little slide or quip in there about the relationship between gray whales and killer whales, which, yeah, I wonder if you can expand on that a little bit, because that's something that I note a lot, like frequently in these flashy documentaries or, news articles. It's talking about, it's focusing on the predator, of the prey, and as gray whales being just a prey resource, not really thinking about their, death or lives lost or calves lost. And I think about that in terms of like humans, like, are we just always thinking what's the right word? Identifying with the top predator? Is that why that narrative persists, instead of focusing more on like, oh, this little gray whale is being killed? I mean, I guess you can also see it in like the African savanna, right, where we're interested more in the lions than in the gazelles. But anyway, I just thought if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the killer whales thing is really fascinating. I will say I actually see parallels today and in both directions in terms of sort of the fascination with killer whales, in relation to gray whales. So I think overall, I would go out on a limb and say that most coverage that killer whales are getting today is decently positive. It's a lot of concern about endangerment. You see a lot about the southern resident killer whales in particular, and their endangerment and their reliance on salmon. And then suddenly when you get gray whales involved, especially anything, or even not just gray whales, anything with mammal-eating killer whales, there's, I think, a discomfort to that. And when you get this other sympathetic, charismatic megafauna involved, the species that you normally see positively portrayed suddenly gets slot into a negative spot for the way that it's preying upon or attacking another charismatic species. So I think there's a conflict of charisma, essentially, happening there. And we continue to see it with particularly gray whales and lagoons in Baja. You'll see in the news descriptions of like, oh, killer whales have discovered gray whales lagoons in Baja, and now they're staking out the entrances and they're stalking the mothers and their babies. And it sounds a lot like the newspaper articles from the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. So there's definitely parallels. And I think there's a few reasons that can kind of be behind those parallels, for a short answer.
All right, Roseanne, go ahead.
I'm curious about the reasoning for using gray whales for heart research as opposed to any other species.
Me too. My explanation, because this was probably one of the most fun parts of the piece that I wrote about this to write, was like, why it's really bad to choose gray whales. Because if you're trying to understand human hearts, gray whales are not a helpful model organism. It would be much more obvious to choose A, a terrestrial species, B, a species that you can easily keep in captivity in some way. So thinking pigs would obviously be more classic. There's a reason that mice and rats are common laboratory organisms. My reasoning that I put forward in the piece, sorry, my microphone, that I put forward in the piece is that it wasn't about unlocking the secrets of human hearts. That was like a justification. Maybe they believed it on some level, but I really think it was about reliving the glory days of whaling. It was when you see the imagery that they're putting out and the way that they're invoking the men that came before them. Scammon gets mentioned. Roy Chapman Andrews, that Indiana Jones figure, gets mentioned. They're following in the footsteps of an established tradition that has become obsolete, that has become a touchstone for nostalgia in the United States. And I will do a shout out to Jamie L. Jones, a literary scholar and also, I would say, energy humanities / environmental historian, to throw in some more confusing subfields, who has written a fabulous book called Rendered Obsolete that is about the obsolescence of the whaling industry in the US and how the whaling industry's obsolescence actually gave it increasing cultural power. So essentially, even though it lost economic power, its obsolescence became this sort of cultural touchstone for often sort of white supremacist specifically nostalgia around kind of a bygone industry and a bygone way of forging particular American futures. So I think the whale cardiology choice of gray whales was ease of access of baleen whales, proximity in California and the lagoons, and about reliving that particular sort of nostalgic, romanticized past.
Other questions in the room? My team in the room likes to make me run to the back. 1 second.
I've had a number of these encounters with friendly whales, both off the West Coast and in Mexico, and there's a couple that I would characterize as aggressively friendly, to the point where if I didn't know anything about whales or the animal's behavior, I would have been scared to death probably. So I just wonder historically how many of these encounters where they were, oh, that's a devilfish, were just friendly encounters that they misinterpreted.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that really shows up in a lot of those early sort of combination of like playful monster stories. I think a lot of them, I don't necessarily think that devilfish or friendly whale behaviors factually exist on their own, if that makes sense. They're a co-produced experience between whales and humans that both are experiencing and sort of creating together. And it requires both of them to be putting something into it, and it also requires both of them to be interpreting that in some way. We can't know what the whales are interpreting it as, but humans can interpret the exact same actions entirely different ways. And that really speaks to the difficulty of trying to establish any kind of baseline for this kind of behavior, because it's not necessarily something I think we can say definitively is or isn't happening in a kind of objective sense, because it's largely interpretive.
Questions in the room? All right.
Have you seen the last Jurassic World movie with Scarlett Johansson?
No, I have
and
to say I
Jonathan
haven't.
Bailey? Okay. The premise of this movie is that the scientists are hunting for the biggest dinosaurs so they can get compounds from their heart to derive new heart medication. And it reminded me of your plot line. So just a thought, could be that they wanted to study the biggest hearts in the world.
I do think, I will say, I think that is one thing that comes up is the size. And as a side note, there are reasons for studying extremes. So for example, NASA regularly employs marine mammal physiologists to understand how marine mammals are able to do the things that they do in extreme contexts so that we might be able to replicate that. I think in this study, they were trying to understand not extreme contexts, so it didn't work so well, but I would guess that similar ideas and images are playing into that depiction. So maybe it's the contemporary version of our 1950s whale cardiology.
So I have a quick question, and maybe this isn't a quick question, and maybe it's a longer conversation, but you alluded to the fact that the story arc from the devilfish to the friendly whale has influenced conservation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm still kind of, I will say this is the piece that I would say is, as a quick note, probably a longer response on this one. So my quick version is that's the piece that I'm still kind of grappling with. But I do think that if we look at the way that this story emerges in the 1970s, it really ends up being a key way that gray whales are seen as valuable and significant from the 1970s onward. It gets invoked a lot in discussions of sort of why this species is important or worth conserving or so on. And that's particularly true in the 1990s when there was a significant battle over their habitat in Laguna San Ignacio in Mexico. There was a battle around salt mining. And this is something that I'm early days of describing, because I didn't discuss this in the dissertation. But I think that there are ways that the friendly whale played into that, and the narrative arc played into that, that are significant and haven't really been fully articulated.
Well, then we need to have you come back.
Sounds good.
All right, everybody, we're at our timeline. So why don't we just give one more round of applause for Anna?
Thank you.
And I hope to see you at the rest of our November whale events. Thanks, everybody. For folks online, we're going to wrap up. Thanks for being here. We'll see you at next event.